Great. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Stephen Williams. I'm a consultant electrophysiologist from Edinburgh. It's my real pleasure to be here today to speak to you all about some of our work in electrophysiology data analysis. And Carlo, thank you indeed for the invitation and your hospitality. And it was also fascinating to see the case on Thursday. So thank you for the opportunity. So I'm going to speak today about our software for analyzing electrophysiology data. But first, I think it's always nice to know with these things where people are coming from. So this is us in Edinburgh, in the south of Scotland. And this is the view out across Edinburgh. And you can see the castle, you can see the cathedral. I actually attended medical school in Edinburgh a number of years ago. And at the time, Edinburgh Medical School was right in the centre of Edinburgh, a beautiful historic building. But inevitably, with progress, this building wasn't suitable for modern medicine. And we moved to this building on the outside of Edinburgh, a very nice campus where we have clinical electrophysiology combined with all forms of medicine, new hospitals in paediatrics and neurology as well. But I wanted to highlight this facility. So this is the national facility in the UK for high performance computing. It's based at the Roslin Institute just outside of Edinburgh. And perhaps this is brave, but we are going to try live in the room today to connect back to Archer 2, which is our Cray supercomputer. So let's see how that goes at the end of the talk. Now, as well as working at Edinburgh, I also work at King's College in London, based at St Thomas's Hospital. So this is us in London, opposite the Parliament, which you can see here. And it was back in 2009, working in this building on the St Thomas's site, where we started to develop the OpenEP platform. Now, at that stage, I was working closely with a colleague, Nick Linton, who is now a consultant electrophysiologist in Imperial. And we were working on a lot of projects primarily to do with atrial mapping. Now, one of these projects was a technology which we'd called ripple mapping at the time, and I'm sure many of you will be familiar now with that technology, showing the translation of our research activities within OpenEP right through to the Carter system in the present day. Now, in order to access electrophysiology data for Nick to develop the ripple mapping, we needed to write data parsers which allowed us to get the data from the Carter mapping system into our software platform. And at the time, we were using MATLAB for software analysis. Over the subsequent years, we added to the system, including data parsers not just for Carto, but for velocity, precision. We're now working on EnSight. And this is one of the first papers in 2017 where we brought together data from at the time, the velocity mapping system with our BARD electrophysiology recording system in order to understand how conduction varied amongst patients with atrial fibrillation. Now, a number of years later, when actually around about the time that I was moving from London to Edinburgh, we recognized the value of this software platform and wanted to open it to the community to enable research around the world. So we tidied the software up, added some documentation, added a website, and we've released it under the name of OpenEP. Now, just to recap for a second and to think about the clinical challenges which we are all familiar with, much of our research using OpenEP is focused on atrial arrhythmias and particularly atrial fibrillation. So atrial fibrillation, of course, is the most common arrhythmia, responsible for a significant burden of symptoms and morbidity. Now, atrial fibrillation is, of course, a major public health problem, and our treatments for atrial fibrillation really are limited in efficacy. Now, our view is that a lack of understanding of the pathophysiological mechanisms underpinning atrial fibrillation provides a limitation to our ongoing ability to innovate in this area. So we are investigating these types of questions using a number of approaches, including imaging, modeling, and electrophysiology. And in our group, we apply these techniques both to clinical research and to animal models. But what I'm going to focus on here today are the tools that we have developed for electrophysiology data analysis. But really, these tools are applicable across the spectrum of our research. Okay, so back to OpenEP, and I'm going to speak about its development, application, and then hopefully show you some of our latest work connecting to Archer. So what was our motivation behind creating OpenEP in the first place? Well, I hope this slide gives you an idea that electroanatomic mapping data is an extremely rich data source, telling us so much more than electrogram voltage and activation. In the top left, this is a view of the left atrium showing atrial anatomy, and showing how the anatomy is represented as a triangulation, revealing exquisite detail about atrial anatomy. In the top right, this is a trace of cardiac motion extracted from a mapping point. Now, this is a composite motion consisting of respiratory motion and cardiac motion, but here we have decomposed this to extract only the cardiac motion, showing how the catheter moves in a particular location. Tissue structure can, of course, be inferred from electroanatomic mapping data. In the bottom left is a voltage map, which you will all be familiar with, perhaps able to identify atrial fibrosis. And then finally, in the bottom right is shown a detailed view of the left atrial posterior roof, showing areas of slow conduction and also vectors representing activation direction. Now, given these rich data sources, you might expect that cardiac electrophysiology in particular may excel when it comes to data-driven innovation and the revolution in AI. However, this is not the case, and the problem is shown here. And despite the explosion in artificial intelligence applied to medicine, really only in the past few years, cardiology in general and electrophysiology in particular are performing really badly. And look, here is our field, right down here at the bottom of the league table, despite all this rich data which we have access to. Now, in my view, one of the main reasons for this is that the data we collect is stored in proprietary formats and held within vendor systems. There's no interoperability between these systems, but worse, there is often no way to even retrieve these data beyond the clinical case itself. Now, if you draw an analogy with medical imaging data, this would be much like a CT or a chest X-ray being available in the radiology department on the screen where it was collected at the time of the patient scan and not subsequently retrievable, forming part of the medical record. This sounds an awful lot like 100 years ago in radiology, and I think this is an incredible missed opportunity, and this is what we hope to solve with OpenEP. So here's the link to the website, the QR code. I can share this with people later on, and also a link to the source code hosted on GitHub. So what is OpenEP? Well, at its core, it's two things. First and foremost, it's a data format which standardizes the storage of electrophysiology data. But secondly, it's a suite of software tools for analysis of that data in a vendor-agnostic format. Now, we performed the software development originally back in 2009 in MATLAB, but more recently we use Python with a Qt graphical interface front end. The software is available under Apache and GNU licenses and is available, as I mentioned, through GitHub. So there are three main components to OpenEP, including modules for data input and storage, visualization and manipulation, and data analysis. Now, at the moment, one limitation is that data input is primarily performed using MATLAB, but we provide distributable versions of the software which you can install on your own computers, not requiring a license from the MathWorks. Visualization and manipulation and data analysis, however, are through our Python framework, which is fully open source. So a few slides just to illustrate some of these features. So this slide illustrates how data from really any electrophysiology system can be stored in the OpenEP format. Now, we provide data parsers, which allow you to convert your own data, but our hope and our vision is that in the future, electrophysiology system manufacturers will integrate this functionality into the system such that you may save OpenEP files directly from your clinical formats. We also provide readers for conventional data formats, so for example, VTK or NIfTY imaging formats to bring in medical imaging data. And we also now interact with the OpenCarp data format, and I'll show why that's important later on in the presentation. Now, one advantage of the OpenEP data model is that it is extremely space efficient. So we're starting now to think about sort of population level research using electrophysiology data. And I don't know if any of you have worked with data from, for example, a carto mapping system or a precision system, but these data sets can run to multiple gigabytes, perhaps with high density mapping up to 15 gigabytes per data set. If you want to then work at population level research, as we do, perhaps involving 10, 20, 100,000 patients, this really becomes an intractable problem. You can't have an individual data set of 50 gigabytes. So the OpenEP format, really by making some very simple improvements to how we store electrophysiology data, can reduce the data format size by several orders of magnitude, such that we're often now dealing with data files that are perhaps in the range of 10 to 100 megabytes per patient. And this now allows us to think about these large population level studies. For visualization and manipulation, we provide some tools in the MATLAB version, but more recently, we have released the software which we've called EP Workbench. So EP Workbench is the first software tool that you can install on your computer that can read OpenEP data in its native format. Now, for those of you who are used to dealing with electron atomic mapping systems, the layout of this interface will be very familiar to you. It looks a lot like an interface from a modern mapping system, showing the electrograms and the maps and having a point viewer. Now, as I mentioned, I'm hoping perhaps a bit bravely to show you the software live in a few minutes, but in case that fails, here is the backup. So here are some screenshots from EP Workbench showing manipulation of the mesh up here on the right, showing loading of the data up here on the left, and really comparing to an image of a conventional mapping system in the bottom right. Now, finally, in terms of data analysis, this is a figure from the 2021 paper, which gives examples of how OpenEP can be used to quantify things like voltage mapping, conduction, geometry, and ablation data. But we performed an analysis where we wanted to work out, are we covering the types of research which is done in our field? So this is a graph showing the types of analysis that are performed currently using electron atomic mapping data and grouping them in red or blue, depending on whether OpenEP currently offers those functionalities. And you can see that OpenEP really provides a broad spectrum of the analysis tools, marrying well to types of research that are happening in contemporary practice. Now, we are adding to these tools all the time. So, for example, since the publication of the paper, we've added the ability to automatically segment a left atrium and perform regional analysis. Okay, so moving on to applications. So for a few minutes, I thought the best way to illustrate this might be through an example from one of our current studies. So this is about periatrial adipose tissue. Now, there have been quite a few papers over the years, of course, looking at the occurrence or existence of periatrial adipose tissue and the pathogenesis of atrial fibrillation. So shown here on the left is an example from a surgical data set showing right atrial adipose tissue influencing atrial conduction. More recently, however, and perhaps drawing influence from the coronary literature, people have started to look at epicardial adipose tissue inflammation quantified by Hounsfield units, with the assumption perhaps that increased inflammation amongst periatrial adipose tissue might form part of the mechanistic link between fat and atrial fibrillation. However, I work with a CT radiologist in Edinburgh, and she tells me that for atrial fibrillation, this assumption perhaps doesn't hold quite true. If you think about abdominal viscera, acute inflammation is associated with changes in attenuation, whereas chronic inflammation less so. So we wondered if we could investigate this question at a high resolution in a panatrial way using OpenEP. And the answer is, of course, we can do that. So this is the study which I'd like to present. So our strategy here is to segment the fat from a CT image using actually a SEG3D, which is a tool from Utah, and then bring in electrophysiology data from CARTO into the EP Workbench software and integrate the imaging with the electrophysiology data. Finally, we then have performed a point-by-point assessment, so looking at each and every electrogram that was recorded during the cases and understanding how factors such as voltage or conduction relate to the existence of periatrial fat in these regions. So we studied around 40 patients, both with and without atrial fibrillation. And then within the atrial fibrillation group, we have about 30 patients in this data set who underwent high-density electroanatomic mapping, representing a sub-study linking electrophysiology to periatrial fat. Now, consistent with the previous data, on the left, we found that periatrial fat volume was increased amongst atrial fibrillation patients. So this isn't new data. However, on the right-hand side, we've actually found that periatrial fat attenuation was reduced rather than increased amongst atrial fibrillation patients. And so this was a surprising finding. We then went on to use OpenEP to quantify the electrophysiological impact of periatrial fat and adipose tissue attenuation. And what you can see on the left is that on a point-by-point basis, as the volume of periatrial fat associated with each mapping point increases, the conduction velocity reduces in that region. So this suggests perhaps a mechanistic relationship between the amount of fat that is present and the electrophysiological properties in that region. However, on the right is the same analysis for fat attenuation, and actually there's the opposite relationship. And what you see is that as fat attenuation decreases, so too do the conduction velocity values. And this is contrary to perhaps what we might have expected from the prior literature. So just to highlight the workflow here and where OpenEP has fitted in, we converted electroanatomic mapping data from CARTO into the OpenEP format using our platform. We created voltage maps and conduction velocity maps, again using OpenEP and the EP Workbench. Segmentation of imaging data, we don't repeat that. There are brilliant tools out there for segmenting imaging data. And in our example here, we've used SEG3D2 from Utah to extract the regions of periatrial fat. But from then on in, all the analysis is done with EP Workbench. So the registration of the electrophysiology data to the imaging data and the quantification on a point-by-point basis of voltage, conduction velocity, fat volume, and attenuation is done using OpenEP. Now, finally, for the last few minutes, I'd like to give you a flavor of where we want to go to next with OpenEP by highlighting two of our ongoing studies and then hopefully demonstrating the software to you. So the first study I wanted to highlight is OpenEP Net. So we're in the process of seeking funding to set up actually a population-level study. So this study will bring together, hopefully, all of the UK's electrophysiology activity in the atrial fibrillation space, bringing the data into a trustworthy research environment provided by a company in Liverpool called AIMS, and then linking that data with linked outcomes, so cardiovascular outcomes from the medical records in the NHS, but also using a study app kindly supported by FibriCheck for patients to report their own outcomes and to do pulse checks. Now, this will represent a totally unique data set, which is for the very first time linking electrophysiology data, describing all that detailed information about tissue anatomy, electrophysiology, function, and so forth with clinical outcomes. We have a couple of international collaborators already in Dublin and in Hamburg, and we've been speaking with collaborators as far afield as Sydney, and so we'd be very happy to open the platform to anybody in the audience who may be interested. Now, the second area I wanted to highlight, we've already had some beautiful presentations from Dr. Garaviri, but it's the use of computational modeling to guide arrhythmia therapies. Now, there have been several in silico studies over the years highlighting the possibility of using modeling to guide ablation. So this is a 2020 paper from Caroline Rooney when she was working with our group in London, who showed that simulations could predict an ideal ablation strategy in a virtual cohort of patients. But what we are now interested in is how we can translate these in silico findings from the biomedical engineering into the treatment for our specific patients. And our strategy is to use OpenEP and EP Workbench to bring together the imaging data, the modeling framework, the action potential information, the cell model, and the tissue properties within EP Workbench to conduct the patient-specific simulations, and linking, shown with the green arrows, with our HPC back in Edinburgh. So I'm probably being brave here, but let's give it a shot. So we would love to show you actually some of the examples of the software. So let's have a look. So you can see, brilliant. So first of all, what should we show first? So here's the electrophysiology platform, EP Workbench. Pardon me, sorry, it's failed already. So on this side, I'll just make it bigger like this, hold on. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see an activation map, you can see the conduction vectors, you can see areas which haven't been mapped, so you can see the problems that Ali was highlighting in terms of conduction velocity assessment. You see how this interface is very familiar to anybody who's used to electroanatomic mapping. You've got your electrograms down here, a point viewer here, and the opportunity to load data at the top. Here is another example, which is now showing conduction velocity information. So we've got conduction velocity ranging from 0.4 to 0.6 meters per second. So this region in blue represents potentially a slow conduction corridor in the posterior left atrium. Question mark is that part of the pathophysiology of the disease for this patient? I think we don't know at this stage. And then, of course, you can see the red spheres representing the ablation points. Here is an example where we've conducted a patient-specific simulation of atrial fibrillation using imaging data and modeling, which was done in collaboration with Ali in the audience, who's paced rapidly from the region of the sinoatrial node. And in a few seconds, I can fast forward the simulation to here, you can start to see that a rotor develops around the region of the crista terminalis and actually sustaining atrial fibrillation in this simulation for the long term. Now, of course, now you can see how it's a relatively short leap to combine the ablation data from this patient's clinical case with what the simulations are telling us about the mechanisms of their arrhythmia. Okay, so then the final piece, which, this will probably fall down, but we've got some backups in case it does, is I really wanted to show you that connection with high-performance computing and show you how rapidly these simulations can run. So I don't know if anybody is interested. Shout out where you would like to paste this atrium, and we can try and run that simulation in real time. Perhaps on the pulmonary veins, posterior wall. Any takers? So what we do is this. So here we go. So first step, we have to define a pacing site. So we have this tool, which is our landmark picker for defining a pacing region. So we can add a landmark. We want to say that it's a pacing site. We'll give that pacing site a name. We'll just call it PP. And then you right-click somewhere on the map. And we would usually define a region for pacing. So think about this as the region that your pacing stimulus would capture from. So let's say that's 5 millimeters. Hit confirm. And in a few seconds, we'll have a landmark there representing this as a pacing site. Now, if we go over here, this window in the middle of the software, this is called our simulation manager. So you can hit new. And I want to show you now how simple it is to run simulations using this platform. So you can hit new, click on the simulation, and it gives you full access to all the options that you might want to configure for that simulation. So what I'm going to do is say that I want to connect to a remote machine. Down here in preferences, we've already specified that the remote machine, let me hit this one here, is our machine Archer back home in Edinburgh. And I'm going to bring up one terminal just to double check we are connected. So we are connected to Archer 2. The reason that terminal is there is because of two-factor authentication. I'm sure you're all familiar with Microsoft Authenticator and endlessly having to type in a 6-digit number, and you have to do that to connect to our machine. You won't necessarily have to do that for all machines. We can then open up this window and select a pacing site. So let's just say we want to pace for a couple of beats, separated by 200 milliseconds. And we're just going to simulate for 1,000 milliseconds just to make this relatively fast. Hit a retrieve location, I'm just going to say I want to save it on my desktop. I'm going to save all of these options and hit run. And at this point in the live demonstration is where things fall down and we find it doesn't run. But don't worry, there is a backup if it doesn't. So now what the software is doing, if I bring up, hopefully I can bring up another window. So you can see in this window here that the software is now connecting. You don't have to see this in the live version. This is just, I want to show you this so you understand what's happening. So the software is now connecting in the back end back to Archer 2, that big machine on the outskirts of Edinburgh. It's packaged up all of the information that's needed to run a simulation of pacing in this patient's anatomy. It's sent all of that information to Archer 2 back in Scotland. And then it's used OpenCarp that I mentioned, which is really a fantastically advanced piece of software for solving the equations that describe propagation of cardiac action potentials. Now the software is going to finish the simulation, and once it's finished, it might, if things are working properly, download the software back to the machine. And don't worry, there's a backup if it doesn't. And then once it's downloaded, you can then play the simulation and you can see what happened in the simulation. So down here in the bottom corner, you can see a little progress bar, which hopefully won't take too long. Don't get too excited. Once it gets to the end, it's going to go right back to the beginning, and it's going to download another 7 files. Okay, so these 7 files describe action potentials at every location within this mesh, and will show us what happens to propagation. So we hit play, and we can see that we've paced from roughly in the region of the superior pulmonary vein, and you can see activation spreading out across the atrium. Now, clearly, this does not tell you too much about physiology in this particular patient. But I think what I wanted to demonstrate is how easy it is now for us as clinicians to be conducting simulations and take these tools from the biomedical engineering into the clinic. And we can now understand how we can start to use these to guide treatments in our patients. So I'm feeling hot under the collar because this was quite stressful to see if she'd run, but it has run and it hasn't failed. And I'm very happy to share this with any collaborators who would like to see it. So if I just go back very finally to the presentation, in conclusion, in my view, electrophysiology data provides an extremely rich and large untapped reservoir of data for studying arrhythmia mechanisms. OpenEP provides a standardized framework for storing, manipulating, and analyzing these data. I gave one example, which was our periatrial adipose tissue study. In my view, future applications are going to allow computational modeling and big data to finally be applied to electrophysiology data, and I believe this is going to result in a transformation in the types of research which is possible in our field. So with that, I will conclude, but I want to just acknowledge all the many collaborators over the years who have contributed to the EP Workbench platform. And I'm delighted again, Cara, thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Williams. Very interesting presentation. Is any you have a question?
It's amazing presentation, and I think it's very nice to summarize because Saturday morning to digest all these high engineering for doctor is not easy. But I think if I understand well, so you can collect any map from any system, you can convert in your software that it looks like when they launched the new iPhone, the revolutionary of the mapping system, and the difference is for 3Ds. And the point is that you can simulate based on the characteristic of the patient, any kind of pacing, any kind of action. My question is, are you already on the next step where you can compare on the future the map of the patient? So if the patient comes for paroxysmal, you perform PVI. If you remap after 7 years, can the machine tell you what is the difference that you find 7 years later?
Yeah, Carlo, thank you. So this is an excellent question. So the machine at this stage cannot do that, but this is undoubtedly the direction of travel. So something that I didn't go into regarding the interface is that we've taken real steps to try to compress everything that's needed to know about the patient into these tiny files. Now this then fits in with the concept of what we call, certainly in the UK and now internationally, the digital twin for the patient. So with our system, we now describe the digital twin as this tiny little file. In fact, it can fit in the size of a QR code. So what we now start to question, and we want to do in our future studies, is understand how the contents of that QR code should change over time. Now, we can only start to do that with the types of large data which we can get from these population-level data sets, but I believe that this is the future. A patient might come back to the electrophysiology lab, data from 5 years ago, how has it changed and what should we do next?
I smile because it sounds like a science fiction movie that we should make a tattoo of the QR code of the patient. When they come to the lab, you can see what was the atrium before. Oh, thank you very much. There are other questions? Please come to the mic because we are recording. And there are people online also following.
Yeah, Stephen, thank you for an exciting presentation. But what I was wondering is, you have to bring the patient in the lab to have the electroanatomical data. So could you learn from all these patients, all these data, all this gathering, something more individualized? Do you see patterns when you analyze thousands and thousands of data that could fit, or could help for an individual patient? Because every heart is different, but of every conduction is different, every atria is different. But are there patterns maybe in the future which could help in, based on clinical variables?
Yes, another excellent question. Thank you. And my view is that yes, there will be. And I have quite a sort of potentially different view, perhaps, to some other lines in the field around this. And the drive constantly for higher and higher density mapping, more and more recording positions, more and more electrodes. And my question really is that needed? And actually, we looked at this for activation mapping a number of years ago now. I think it's published in Europace. And if you simply want to diagnose the mechanism of atrial tachycardia from a map, the number of mapping points that you need is quite low. It's around about 1 point per centimeter. And this gives you, per centimeter squared. And this gives you the optimal data efficiency, but also diagnostic accuracy. And I think this then relates to what we need to know about the patients in the future. So if, for example, we say, well, we must know that we recorded high-density maps in every patient to guide management of arrhythmias, well, this is not feasible for all of the millions of patients with atrial fibrillation. But I believe there will be redundancy in the data, and we can start to learn that once we have these population-level data sets. So perhaps understanding how ECG characteristics, maybe body surface potential mapping, maybe clinical characteristics, relates to the electrophysiological patterns that we all see on a day-to-day basis from intracardiac mapping. And perhaps we'll be able to start to bridge that gap from what we can gain non-invasively, perhaps with augmented recordings, to what we see invasively, and then understand how we can innovate in order to improve the treatments for these patients.
Thank you very much. If there are no other questions, thank you, Stephen.